Thanks. Yeah. And I'll be talking about disrupting dominant narratives and how we can empower animal advocacy with data. So I'm going to just start straight away with what is a narrative. So a narrative is like a set of stories, myths, ideas, or beliefs which propagate through a culture. And they have an influence on the way we see the world and the way we act. So it can affect how we interpret events, which is the way we perceive the world. And it can also influence the way we behave, because they can kind of sort of dictate and shape social norms. And just a couple of examples of real world narratives. So the first is the American dream, which is one that kind of says, like, you know, if you come to America, everyone's got the equal opportunity to work hard and kind of make the life that they want. And this kind of like emphasizes values of like individualism and hard work and things like that. And then back in 2016, I can't believe it's that long ago already, we were debating should the UK leave the EU. And there was kind of two sort of opposing narratives going on. So leavers said, you know, we want to take back control of our sovereignty and get control again over immigration. Whereas the remainers were saying, oh, but that's going to come with all this economic risk, and we're going to lose certain rights and protections. And so I'm going to kind of describe our theory of narrative change. So when we're communicating to people about animal freedom, you know, you've probably heard the phrase like, oh, we've planted a seed there. You know, we like to think of ourselves as planting ideas in people's heads, and hopefully over time that will grow into something. But I feel like at the moment we're living in a world with like an infertile cultural landscape. The dominant narratives are kind of fostering these beliefs and attitudes which kind of prevent these seeds from germinating. So hopefully by changing the narrative, we can find new narratives that will change the cultural landscape and sort of facilitate all of these seeds to germinate. And so here's what we want to do. We want to improve attitudes towards other animals. And we can do this by first centering animals in our messages and stories through positive portrayals, and reinforce existing helpful narratives about them. And we also want to see new persuasive narratives. And hopefully what this will achieve is to kind of crowd out those harmful narratives that are currently sort of maintaining the status quo. And the reason we believe this can work is because it's worked in previous social justice movements. This is just two examples. So the freedom to marry movement was, well, more of a campaign, I suppose, to legalize gay marriage in America. And previously their narrative was one about rights and deserving the right to marry. And they changed it to one of having the freedom to marry the person that you love. And, you know, in America, the concept of freedom that resonated really well with people. And by targeting values that people had, they were able to change the way people voted. And in quite a short space of time, they were able to succeed in their campaign. Similarly, Black Lives Matter, you know, I think everyone's heard that phrase. The narrative they're saying there is, all these killings, we're being treated like our lives don't matter. And that short phrase made it spread really well, and it captured the zeitgeist so that, you know, it's very tweetable, and it's become like a household phrase, I suppose. So here's Animal Think Tank's narrative research project. We want to find the most effective cultural narratives that will help us win public support for animal freedom. And so I want to first kind of give you a bit of a taster of what it's like to take part in our research. and Natalie will be helping me with this. So I'm going to show you a couple of questions or statements, and I want you to think how much you agree with them. So for each statement, I just want you to type in the chat the number that corresponds to how much you agree or disagree with the statement. So the first being, eating animal products is a part of the natural food chain or cycle of life. So just enter the number in the chat for me. And because I'm sharing my screen, Natalie's going to have to watch the chat for me, and maybe you could share kind of what people are putting.
Sure thing. Yeah, we're getting lots of ones coming through. So people strongly disagreeing, or we've got a 2 in there as well, so disagree. But yeah, mainly all ones and just the odd 2.
I mean, colour me shocked, really. You know, that was an easy one, I suppose. So the next one is, humans have a unique value that sets them apart from other animals. So yeah, just like before, 1 to 7, please enter the number that corresponds to how you feel.
Where? I can't see where to enter.
So I'm just going to mute people because we are recording. Yeah, getting a real mix actually. Lots of 1s in there, the odd 2 and 3, even a 5. So somewhat agree.
Cool. Few
5s actually, yeah, and a 4.
Yeah, I sort of had a feeling that one might be more mixed. At the narrative workshop in February, I sort of asked a similar question, and that one was quite mixed as well. But yeah, I guess there's a bias towards disagreeing in general. And then finally, the third one is, animals should be recognized as sentient beings who feel pain and emotions. So yeah, if you could put into the chat the number corresponding to how you feel on that.
Getting lots of 7s come in. I think they're all 7s actually, from what I can see.
Brilliant. Cool. Any more? Is that it? Yeah. That's great. So basically, our research involves asking people to fill in surveys with many, many more questions than just those 3. Some of them will involve qualitative questions where they would kind of expand either through written text or talking to us about their feelings, their thoughts, experiences. And then some will involve experiments that I'll talk a bit about later, where we test the effectiveness of different narratives. And there's some different things we can do with this data. So the first is to create profiles about people based on the way that they respond to this array of questions. It helps us understand the general attitudes and beliefs of the population, and hopefully we can then track, are these attitudes changing over time? And it helps us predict, you know, are these different types of people responding differently to different narratives? And so here's the research questions that we've got. So previous research has kind of already identified lots of harmful and beneficial narratives that I will be describing a bit in a moment. But so far, these haven't been quantified, in the sense that we don't know how widespread these narratives are or how strongly the general public endorses them. And we also don't know like which narratives work or how well they work. So that's something we've been doing in our 2 kind of research streams. So I'm going to start with, which harmful narratives does the general public endorse? And I know we've got people from all over the place, but this is a representative sample of the UK. So hopefully it's kind of generalizable, but obviously just something to bear in mind. And I'll go over this graph more later on, but basically we've kind of found 7 dominant narratives that the general population endorses, and they endorse them to different levels as well. So I'm going to kind of go through these different narratives that we've identified first, and then we can talk about it in a bit more detail. So the first one, this was found in the academic literature first, but it's really reassuring that we can kind of replicate it. It's the 4 Ns, or normal, natural, necessary, and nice. And these are like the top 4 justifications that people give for eating meat. So, you know, either everyone does it, so why can't I? It's natural, i.e., my ancestors ate meat, lions eat meat, so therefore I should be able to. Necessary, there's a strong belief that you can't have a healthy, balanced diet without meat. And then finally, it's nice, you know, it's associated with certain memories like Christmas, or it just tastes nice and people enjoy it. And so when people fill in our surveys, people that endorse this narrative will agree with things like, I was raised eating meat and it feels normal to continue doing so. Or the example I gave earlier, eating animals products is part of the natural food chain or cycle of life. And yeah, so not surprisingly, our sample here today is pretty low in endorsing this particular narrative. But it is quite an influential one, and it's one that that's pushed by the industry quite effectively. So here's an example of an ad campaign where they've got kind of the meat as the center of the dish. And to a meat eater, I'm sure this looks really appetizing. So they're kind of tapping into the niceness aspect of it. But the tagline is also, we eat balanced, basically implying that the only way you can have a healthy, balanced diet is like with a big chunk of meat and a bit of salad on the side. And also, of course, you've got the glass of milk there in the top right, totally essential. The next common narrative that we've identified is one called anthropocentrism, which is a belief that sort of puts humans as the sort of top of the hierarchy of moral worth. And it basically says that humans are kind of uniquely special and separate from the rest of nature. And that because of these features, we have the right to use other animals for our ends. And so people that endorse this narrative would agree with these sorts of statements, like humans inherently have more value and rights than other animals, or that humans have a unique value that sets them apart from other animals. The next narrative is economy. And this is basically the belief that we kind of need the meat, dairy, egg industry to support and maintain the economy that we currently have. And that, you know, farmers need us to continue purchasing these products in order to keep their livelihoods and their jobs. Also, now that we're kind of going through this period of kind of financial insecurity, there's this element of kind of needing to feed the population at large, and a belief that without, you know, animal products, we wouldn't be able to feed the whole population affordably. And so people that endorse this narrative would agree strongly with these sorts of comments. Rural communities often depend on animal farming for their livelihood, and the meat, dairy, and egg industries are crucial for the economy, providing jobs and revenue. And this is another one that, at least in the UK, that I'm aware of, is pushed by the industry. So you can see like the British flag there, kind of tapping into the idea of Britishness and supporting each other by buying local British food, back British farmers, and so on. Another narrative we found is one called Meat is Manly. So this gentleman on the left here is a YouTuber who goes by the name Liver King, and he's known for endorsing this carnivore diet where you basically entirely eat animal products, and a lot of his videos involve him eating raw liver. So he was kind of selling this idea that that's how, you know, that's the diet you need to be this like alpha male with loads of muscles, until it was kind of found out that he takes loads of steroids. But I mean, who would be surprised just looking at him. So where does this like belief come from? I think it comes from, in part, this kind of traditional idea that, you know, the men go out hunting and they provide the like essential nutrients to the rest of the tribe. And so as a result of that, meat represents like strength, power, virility, and the act of killing kind of represents dominance and power. And so by like consuming meat, you're kind of strengthening the gender identity of being this like strong and powerful provider, basically. And so people that believe in this narrative would agree with these sorts of statements. Like eating meat is associated with strength and masculinity, or refusing meat can be seen as a sign of weakness or femininity. Yet another one that gets used by the industry. So here's an example of an ad where they're trying to convince men to buy more bacon to put on their burgers, basically saying like, if you want to be manly, you need to eat more bacon. Yeah. The final one that I would consider as a harmful narrative is that of welfarism, which is basically the belief that animals should have their welfare protected, which, you know, that makes sense, but that it's okay to consume kind of high welfare animals. I think the problem with this is that the public are actually largely in the dark about how high welfare animals are actually treated. You know, I think the chicken on the left is kind of how a lot of people imagine free-range chickens get to live their lives. But when they're actually polled about like specific practices that go on in high welfare farms, the vast majority of people are against them. So examples of the types of statements that a welfarist would agree with would be animals used for food, clothing, or other purposes should be treated humanely, or I support standards and regulations that ensure the welfare of animals used in farming. So here's kind of what I think the problem is with this, is that it can be used to kind of alleviate people's guilt. So believing that you're kind of consuming an animal product that came from an animal that like lived a good life and like a painless death kind of perpetuates the purchasing of those products. So like this example here, you know, they're representing the lives of these chickens in a way that's just not representative of the vast majority of chickens that are farmed. However, we did also find some helpful narratives. So what are those that people endorse? So the first is kind of the vegan narrative. You know, you might not see that as a narrative, but it's kind of like a set of beliefs that gets spread throughout the culture. It's a way of framing things. And it basically boils down to avoiding animal products is better than consuming animal products. It also entails this kind of idea that change change of the system takes place at the individual level. So like you're responsible for the harm that you do, and you can kind of control that basically. And so people that endorse this view would respond to questions in agreement with things like choosing not to eat animal products is a more ethical lifestyle, or society's acceptance of veganism or vegetarianism is a sign of moral advancement. The final narrative that we found was that of sentientism. So sentience is the capacity for an individual to have a subjective internal experience, which gives them the ability to have feelings and perceive things and feel pleasure and pain. And it also entails the belief that animals other than humans are also sentient. And therefore, because of their sentience, they have personal interest, and therefore their rights should be protected. And so people who are sentientists would agree with these statements. animals should be recognized as sentient beings who feel pain and emotions, or animals deserve legal rights that protect them from harm and exploitation. So kind of the aim of this project was kind of to see like how widespread are these narratives? We know they exist, how common are they? And this kind of goes back to the plot that I showed you at the start. So each kind of column represents one of those different narratives. The height of the blue bar represents the proportion of people that agree with that narrative, and the height of the kind of pink/pinky red bar is the proportion that disagree, while grey represents kind of indifferent people. And so we find the top two narratives are the welfarist narrative and the economy narrative. So perhaps these are the two that we need to kind of be sort of undermining or overshadowing as much as we can. Luckily, though, sentientism and veganism, the two positive, beneficial narratives, come in third and fourth place. I actually find it quite surprising that the veganism narrative is endorsed by 60% of the population when, you know, only like 2% of people are vegan, and maybe up to, I think it's like up to about 10% are some form of like vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, reducitarian. So that's really useful to know. And I think what this shows us is that the public actually feel conflicted. On the one hand, they recognize what the right thing to do is, and they recognize that animals are individuals with personal interests who can suffer. But on the other side, they're supporting this like really kind of abusive industry. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, this conflict has to be won by one of these two narratives, and it often goes in the wrong direction because there's these like dominant narratives that we've already talked about. So how do we bolster beneficial narratives and find new ones? So this is the second stream of research that we've been doing, testing messages. So we recruit a group of participants and we expose them to a different set of narratives. So this could be reading it could be reading like a document, or it could be watching a video that forms an ad campaign, for example, promoting animal freedom. But different participants will be exposed to different narratives. And we then measure their attitudes about animal freedom, like the ones that I've been showing you. And the aim is to see, do the people that are exposed to certain narratives end up reporting better attitudes towards animals? So first, I'm kind of going to show you a couple of narratives that didn't work, because after all, this is science and you don't know if it's going to work until you've done it. So unfortunately, we do get null results. One of them is identity, so kind of appealing to people's identity. So for example, we had messages that said things like, you know, we're a nation of animal lovers, so why do we allow the practice of factory farming to continue? Or similarly, you know, we're all caring individuals, so why do we let factory farming continue? Another one was descendants. So, you know, we're going to be leaving a world behind, right? We're currently descendants of future generations, and we want to leave a better world for them. But unfortunately, we found that none of these appeals to identity actually had any effect on people's attitudes. Apparently also in the environmental literature, similar studies, I think someone's just unmuted. Similar studies have attempted to appeal to identity and also found it doesn't improve like environmental behaviors. So maybe kind of targeting people's identities doesn't work, but we could target the values that are associated with their identity. Like maybe someone doesn't like see themselves as a caring individual, but they do care about others. So kind of future research will be kind of targeting those values. The next thing that didn't work was using the terminology speciesism and oppression. So we actually found that when these terms were used, it actually made attitudes worse. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First is these are kind of like activist jargon. It's not the usual language that most people use, and it sounds weird to the average ear. It also kind of paints the listener, the receiver of the message, as like the bad guy, like we're responsible, we are speciesist and we're responsible for their oppression. So I think what's happening is it kind of creates like a feeling of reactance and like kind of steeling yourself against the message. So I think we need to either avoid these types of terminology or do more work to make these terms more widespread. So for example, you know, when feminism started, a feminist or sexism were like new terms, but they're now like widespread common household words. But luckily, we have found some narratives that have worked. And I'm going to explain those now. So the first is social progress. So society, basically this narrative entails the idea that society is progressing all the time, and that animal freedom is just the next step in that progress. And that, you know, you can refer to past movements such as the suffragettes as part of that. We also found that messages that were about social progress but made no mention of animals also improved attitudes towards animals. So that's known as a spillover effect. So basically in one message, we talked about like LGBT rights and how society's moving along and making it more, it's becoming more equal and fair, and there's now rights to protect people. And that's a good thing. And we found that people then had higher attitudes about animals. And we believe this is because it's kind of activating the same values of like universalism and benevolence. The next one that works quite well is reminding people of the unique abilities and diversity of abilities of other animals. Like all other animals have their own unique kinds of intelligence. And this can help create a sense of awe and reverence towards those animals. And then finally, the third that we found worked quite well was emphasizing morality, framing the issue as this is a moral issue. What would, you know, the right thing to do would be to facilitate animal freedom. One way this can be done is, you know, invoking the golden rule, which a lot of people believe in. That is, we should treat others the way we would wish to be treated. So with this all in mind, what can we do about it? The first is, I think, a strategy known as pulling back the curtain. So researchers found that if you just present the harmful narratives as they are to people that might believe them, it kind of like, they kind of see it as it really is. So if you say like, you know, a lot of people believe eating meat is okay because it's natural, people, the person that hears that can like recognize that actually like that doesn't really make sense if you think about it. And I think here's two ad campaigns that do that quite well. So on the left, Elwood's Organic Dog Meat is a sort of parody site kind of, where they pretending to sell dog meat, and they use all the same lingo from the meat industry, like it's delicious, it's local, free range, humanely harvested. And obviously this riles people up, and then when they go to the website, they see they're just trying to point out that these reasons are not good enough. Similarly, on the right is an ad trying to break down the humane myth by saying like humane milk is a myth. And it raises the awareness of people by mentioning that dairy calves are separated from their mothers, so that humans can take their milk. So I think another thing we can do is flip the narrative. So for example, with the 4 Ns, we can raise people's awareness about vegan food being natural, normal, necessary, and nice. And we can also raise people's awareness about there being nothing natural or nice about things like industrial factory farming. Similarly, the belief that meat is manly, we can ask people, like, what does it actually mean to be a man? You know, I would say that caring for others is the mark of a true man. And then similarly, the economy narrative could focus on the plant-based transition and supporting farmers to keep their livelihoods, but just doing something else. And examples of organizations already doing that are the Plant-Based Treaty and Animal Rising. Next is I would argue for values-based messaging. So I think people already have the right values, their hearts are in the right place, but like I said earlier, they feel conflicted. And there's this kind of lifetime of narratives that have been instilled in them that are very hard to overcome. So I think using messages that activate the right values without arising this internal conflict might help there. And then finally, we need to use narratives that work. So we've found that these 3 narratives, social progress, abilities, and morality, are ones that are more likely to increase people's reported attitudes. So we're going to have like a kind of Q&A session now. Before we go on to that, just want to draw your attention to the webinar next month, which will be with Jim Mason, who authored An Unnatural Order. And this book's been really influential for our thinking at Animal Think Tank. Similarly, if you'd like to sign up to our newsletter, if you haven't already, you'll hear about more webinars and the research that we're doing. And if you would like to support our ongoing work and research, you can scan the QR code there to donate. So I guess we'll open up the conversation now. And yeah, I'd love to hear what everyone thinks.
Thanks, Rob. Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can see everyone's faces?
Yeah, I was thinking of leaving it up just for a minute in case people want to scan the codes.
Oh, yeah, good idea.
But would you mind like facilitating the like questions and stuff?
Yeah, sure. We've got a question from Maureen. She'd like to know how you selected survey respondents.
Respondents?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it depends on the specific study. So they're recruited online, and there's platforms that allow you to kind of create a survey. You put it on the platform and it gets sent out to people who've signed up to take part in paid research. And they have options. So if you want, for example, to have a representative sample, they've got all that information about the demographics and so on. So you can kind of tick the box for that. Yeah, and then also Natalie's doing some work on kind of the supportive base, and she's targeting kind of like, I guess, vegan Facebook groups and things like that. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
So yeah, if people want to put their questions either in the chat or put their digital hand up, and yeah, you can ask Rob directly. Corinda?
Yeah, so I want to thank you for coming, and thank you for organizing it. My question is, you know, with the mink,
Yeah.
you want, how do you make to use your weight? And also, I want to know why people killing animals.
I'm really sorry, the like audio quality is really poor. Can you try again, or maybe just type it in the
Yeah,
chat?
so I wanted to know why people killing animals, like why are people like drinking animals not very nice, and people just eating animals. And also what else is when people are vegetarian,
Mhm.
how would it work when people are vegetarian?
So why do people kill animals, and then why do I couldn't hear the second part, sorry.
Like, how do people with vegetarian?
Yeah.
How would it work with people who are vegetarian?
How does it work when they're vegetarian?
Yeah.
Like, can you clarify what you mean? Like, how does what work?
Do you
So,
mean what
like,
inspires people and motivates them to go
yeah,
vegetarian? Is that the
yeah,
question?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing more
yeah.
research into that. I don't know if you want to speak to that anymore, Rob.
Yeah, so I guess that second part of the question, it's hard to answer right now because we haven't got the results yet. It seems to be, I don't know, do you have any have you had any insights yet, Natalie, since you're spearheading that?
Yeah, no, still results coming in, so too early to say, but yeah, just to make people aware of some research we've got going on at the moment. It's focusing on people who already care about animal issues and support animal issues, and finding out what motivates them and inspires them to care about these issues, and also take action as well. So we'll be able to share the results of that in the next couple of months.
Yeah. And then as for like killing, you said killing animals, do you mean just like why to like everyday, why would an everyday person do it?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess it's rare for someone to directly do it. Hunting, I suppose. They might believe in the meat is manly narrative, or some narrative about welfare, you know, that if the animal has lived a wild, free life, then that makes it okay. As for like, you know, like animal abuse, I can't really comment. I don't know, to be honest. It boggles the mind.
Our webinar next month with Jim Mason, he really dives deep into the big kind of deep cultural narratives that like really inform like how people think the way they do, like how we've kind of grown to think this way as a society. So really encourage people to come along to next month's webinar, because he kind of really pulls back the curtain on that, as it were. Courtney, you have a question?
Yes, thank you all. This is really, as I continue to engage with the research you all are doing, I continue to be impressed, and I think it's very important for us to do it this step-by-step manner that you all take. I'm particularly curious about the social progress aspect, and I think that ties up very well with other elements of the research you've done, this evolving narrative that's important for people, and the idea that people aren't necessarily just seen as consumers, but as people who can create different narratives and live in a culture in which they're citizens. I'm wondering, my question, I guess, is about what level of agency do you think, and this might be grounds for further research, that we should bring to people on this social progress vein? I mean, should we be saying this is happening and you should just be aware of it and become be amenable to it when it shows up, or what role do you have to advance this? And I do think that you probably get a lot of general buy-in philosophically to, yes, I could see this happening down the road, and that seems okay, but like now you need to, right now you need to start, your behaviors need to start reflecting this shift. I think there's a big difference. So yeah, just the thoughts along what that looks like in terms of what we ask from people.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think maybe this isn't a satisfying answer, but yeah, maybe we do need like a range of levels of agency. So the kind of like people on the extreme we're going to be asking like, get on board and do something. The people in the middle, sort of movable middle, maybe just changing their opinions and values will be enough, because it will make those kind of more radical extreme people be perceived as like less extreme. Yeah, but like you said, more research is needed.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of like two-pronged, isn't it, Rob? Like we're looking at what can change people's attitudes, but then also what can motivate them to take action as well. So yeah, definitely further research needed. I think, Barbara, did you have your hand up first, and then I'll come to you, Pamela?
I had, but you can continue with other people, and I can stay like in the end, because if you don't have time, I can talk to you like privately.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Barbara, we'll come back to you. Pamela, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. So thank you. It's been really interesting presentation. And yeah, food for thought. So I've got a couple of questions about the wording that you're using. When you talk about narratives, obviously I understand what narratives are, but I sometimes think that, well, I'd be interested in hearing your views on using words like propaganda, because narrative seems to imply that, you know, the whole thing has just somehow sort of like, you know, magically appeared, and is quite a sort of, it's an unloaded term, and I think that is in itself part of the problem. So that's narratives. Then there's using words like meat. I was interested to hear that you were using it alternately with words like animal products. And again, simultaneously, I tend to use, or I tend to think that it's better to use words like animal body parts, or, you know, the body. I mean, although it's quite long, I feel like it's, you know, it's like, what's her name? That woman that wrote the what was it? The Absent Reference. Carol, what was her name? Carol. I'm sure you've read read all this. That by having the word meat, you're taking the animal away from it. So yeah, I'd be interested in what you've got to say about those words. And then I'm also interested in your concept of saying that speciesism is a turnoff, and I can't remember the other word you used. And is it may be a turnoff. But I think in the same way that feminism and feminist are, they identify something that previously was really unidentified, I think. And therefore it's kind of quite key to reframe the conversation. If it is somewhat, people might be a bit hacked off, but I mean, how hacked off are they really? Or are they just feeling a bit like, oh, it's a bit jargony? But is it like it's jargony, but it's so okay? So those are my sort of starters for 10, really.
I'll probably have to ask you what they were again, but I'll just go with my initial kind of like feeling of that. So I think there is a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't there? Like, on the one hand, like, since sort of doing this, I've been trying to change like the language that I use. You know, like I used to always refer to animals as it, and now I make a conscious effort to refer to them as they. And now it feels weird to refer to them as it, and that's helped me see them as like more individual and so on. The example of meat, I suppose I just use it as like a kind of shorthand, maybe, but I totally get like the issues with it. I think it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, it helps to use the language that people naturally use. I think on the other, you don't want to on the other, if you use the more kind of, I don't know, PC language, for want of a better word, it has the risk of turning people off. And I think it goes back to this like conflict people have, that it's very easy to get people to go into these like cognitive sort of defense strategies where they sort of try and protect their perception of like a good person. And I think if we use language like animal flesh, for example, it's very I think people find it very easy to then switch you off and then they're not listening. Hope that answered a bit of the question. Do you want to like refresh my memory?
Yeah, I'd also like to come back to you on that one. It was what was it? But it's actually a fact, isn't it? I mean, meat is not a fact. Animal flesh and animal body parts are a fact, and surely part of the, I mean, it's not like people are going to be automatically on board. I mean, this is the thing. I mean,
that's true.
What you're talking about, you know, you're talking about basically claims making and sort of theories, but I'm kind of I just feel like it's really important to call it what it is.
Can
I mean-
I jump in here? Because we have read like Carol Jane Adams and Joan Denier, and yeah, that is really influential for us. And we obviously do want to like shift towards more pro-animal language, but we have found that people do have this resistance, and actually like it turns them off the message. So along like part of our research is understanding how far we can take our language at this point in time, but thinking like we shift it incrementally. And that's just unfortunately the way it is. You kind of have to speak to people in the language that resonates for them and keep pushing them in that direction, because otherwise it just jars and people will just shut down and not even listen to your message. It's kind of got to be, they've got to hear the message rather than just the language we're using, if that makes sense, Pamela.
Well, yeah, but that's I don't know how much that is actually. I mean, you're saying that with a lot of confidence, and presumably you will have done some research on that. But I come back to, you know, using words like, you know, not using words like feminist, you know, or black person, rather than the pejorative terms that were used, you know, as we all know, not so very long ago. And I mean, I can't imagine a similar conversation, you know, like say back in the 60s, where you had people advocating for sort of, you know, women's rights and say, well, yes, well, we don't really want to use words like feminist because it turns people off. Well, of course it turns people off because it's the dominant culture. And yeah, and suppose what would you have said then if your animal think tank was like sort of like feminist think tank or something, not in the 60s? What would you be saying then? I mean, what would you be saying? You know, well, we don't want to use the word feminist, although it clearly is a position that most people don't understand, and it creates a reality that is invisible to most people. I just don't understand it, and I wonder if there's some sort of like exceptionalism in the case of animal causes, because this often not necessarily intentionally, but because it is other animals rather than humans, and I'm concerned about that, because again the other word that I was interested in or focusing on was propaganda rather than
that was it, yeah.
And so yeah, and I think because, you know, it's all part of a propaganda.
Pamela, sorry, just to jump in, I'm just like time checking here. If Rob's able to answer your question, then we can open the floor to other people, if that's all right.
Hopefully, Pamela, we can have a really good in-depth discussion about this at some other time, because I think you've raised some really interesting and valid points. Totally going to take this away and have a think about it. And also, you know, we're not claiming to know the answer, and with research especially, it's always evolving. And maybe next year I'll say, actually, we need to go hard on this. I don't know. And then with regards to the propaganda point, I'd love to like do some testing around that, because it's, yeah, like raising people's awareness that they're being kind of lied to by these kind of greedy industries. I think that has potential to work.
Yeah, we're kind of inspired by another campaign called the Truth Initiative that kind of did a similar thing against the tobacco industry, and that was really powerful as well. So yeah, that is like quite high up on our list of projects to focus on in terms of research and how people respond to this idea of like deception from the industry. Do we have any other questions? Otherwise I'll come back to Corinda and then Barbara before we close. Anyone else like to ask a question who hasn't already spoken? See if we've got any in the chat. Corinda, do you want to ask your question, and then I'll come back to you, Barbara?
Right, so I have two questions to ask you, Rob. My first question I'll put it in the chat, or I put it in the chat, is can the meat use weight in your body? Like, can it use weight? And my second question is, do you feel more study about animal behavior?
Animals than what, sorry?
Do we feel more study animal behavior?
No, this is more about like human attitudes about animals.
Right.
Yeah, and there's lots of great ethology books out there, Corinda, if you're interested, that do film and study animal behaviourists. So like Mark Beekoff, Jonathan Balcom, they're really great ethologists that you can look into.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you asked about
Yeah.
losing weight. I mean, like, it's, yeah, I guess I don't have the expertise to give like dietary advice. I mean, I think you can lose weight on sort of any diet, but not that would like justify kind of what has to be done to the animals. I don't think that would justify eating meat or animals.
Barbara, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I really loved your presentation, Rob. Yeah, very good. And I didn't know like all these discoveries. I just like with this result about like narratives that work like social progress, abilities, and morality, I was thinking here, if you have been thinking about like where to circulate these narratives, because for example, social progress is a narrative that I'm not sure if it's going to work with like right-wing population. And maybe abilities in the end would work for animal lovers, even though they don't identify as animal lovers. So yeah, so I was wondering like if you have started to think about like in like which target groups you could like put these narratives there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I haven't started thinking about it in depth, but it's definitely part of the plan to eventually look at kind of how different segments will respond to different narratives. So like you said, social progress probably won't resonate with right-wing people. And also another aim is to do look at like the effect of how the narrative is kind of propagated. So like only one example I can think of off the top of my head is studies have sort of shown to use like trusted messengers. So like if a farmer or maybe I can't think of another example, farmer's giving the message, it's more likely to be accepted than some like eco-warrior lefty vegan. Yeah, but yeah, it's like research that we're going to do eventually.
Wonderful, thank you.
Any other questions? Evan, Jane, Chris, have you unmuted to ask a question?
Yes, I have a number of questions. I think, first of all, that, and I delineated them in the chat. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to raise my hand.
It's okay.
Yeah, first of all, I think that we need to change our perception of who the world believes that we are, because I think that they think that people who advocate for things like this are these elitists, and we need to sort of dumb down our message, the lowest common denominator, if you will, because truth be told, those are the people who are consuming most of the meat. They're uninformed, and they refuse to believe that anything is wrong with any of the current systems. So I think we need to sort of get down to the bottom level, which is kind of like against what I think most of us would want to do, and just explain it to them in the simplest terms. I think we need to appeal to people's growing fears of what's happening with climate change, without maybe using those trigger terms like climate change or global warming, but appeal to them to the fact that look what's going on around you. Look at all the flooding. Look at all the fires. Look at all the droughts. Look at starvation levels rising. The food supplies are becoming endangered in so many areas because of these things. And let them know that, these things are happening. They're real. They're coming to you soon. And if we don't shift away from, our current attitudes about what it is we eat and what we need to sustain the planet, that we're all going to die. I mean, without sounding too alarmist, which is a very, very tricky line to walk. But somehow we need to incorporate all those things into our messaging, being very, very clear, being catchy, but being simple and appealing, if you will, to people's fears, because I think in this case, that may be the only way to get through to them. We do need to to massively shift our global food production system. This is obvious. And we should sort of pair it, if I may, with our need to shift our dependence away from fossil fuels. The same sort of things. There are two streams. They need to happen at the same time, concurrently.
Evan, sorry to interrupt. I'm just aware we've only got a couple of minutes. Did you want to formulate a question for Rob, or was it more just kind of sharing thoughts and him?
Well, yeah, more like suggestions. And the one question I do have is, in the US where I am, the lobbyists are so powerful for the meat and dairy industries. It's really, really quite daunting to try to make an inroad in there, in terms of like lessening their stranglehold on the food system, production system in the United States. How might we best do this?
Such a big question.
Yeah, it's sort of like the meat totally. Of the meat, no pun intended, of the whole issue.
Yeah, it's like more than an uphill battle, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know where to start.
Well, these are just things to sort of think about, because I sign a zillion petitions all the time. I share information. I try to increase awareness. But, I'm up against these powerful and well-moneyed interests. Yeah.
Yeah. That's sort of, so our kind of approach is like a systemic approach, actually trying to change the system and create narratives that will like get lots of people on board. Because, like I was saying in the talk, like people's values are already there. It's just making that connection and kind of overriding the power of these like lobbies and things in people's minds, but even if it's just for long enough to get them to act. And I kind of hope like these sorts of social changes, like they kind of happen exponentially, so it's going to feel like a really long time when nothing's happening,
right?
And then all of a sudden there'll be some like trigger,
usually a disaster, some kind of catastrophe.
Possibly.
That's the only way that humans ever actually do anything.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's examples of like social justice movements where that's not necessarily been the case. Like, but it'll certainly take off. I hope. I'm hopeful. I feel confident that that's going to be the case.
And I'm really sorry, just jump in, like really encourage people to look up Freedom to Marry as well, because they were, they had this strategy, they were at it for a really long time, and it was only when they did a lot of public research that they understood what people's kind of barriers were, like where there were like opportunities to leverage, like, and they understood that they really had to message to their values. And within 11 years they had marriage equality in 50 US states, whereas they've been trying for decades before, and that was through a lot of public research and through this strategy of narrative change. So that is a really inspiring example of how this can happen.
Right, which is what you're endeavoring to do, and I'm totally behind you. I think the messaging has to be very clear, and as I mentioned earlier, it has to really just sort of hit home with people in a very easy, sort of catchy way, which is really kind of tricky. Because there are people's attitudes are so ingrained, and most people, I'm in my 60s, I was raised eating meat, but then my mother became a vegan later in life. And my whole family actually shifted over once I told them the horror of what was going on.
We are at time.
Okay.
But yeah, if people want to stay on afterwards, I'm going to stop the recording now. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us. Really great questions and insights coming up. And yeah, hopefully you'll be able to join us for next month's webinar on the 30th of August with Jim Mason. That's like really insightful conversation to look forward to. And yeah, thank you, Rob, for your presentation.
Thanks. And thanks for everyone's enthusiasm and passion. I love it. It's great.